Hi everybody, welcome to the Intro to EKG video. This will be part 1 of 3 where we will go over the basics of the EKG. An EKG or an electrocardiogram allows us to measure the electrical activity of the heart. But let's first start by reviewing the anatomy of the heart. The heart has 4 chambers which are broken down to the right and the left side, and the atria and the ventricles. The atria are the top 2 chambers and the ventricles are the bottom 2 chambers. Venous or deoxygenated blood flows into the heart via the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood gets pumped to the right ventricle, which then pumps the blood into the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. At the lungs, CO2 is dropped off and O2 is picked up. The oxygenated blood returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins and flows into the left atrium. It then gets pumped down to the left ventricle, which pumps the blood out through the aorta and throughout the body. Then the whole cycle repeats again with each heartbeat. The heart's electrical system starts with the SA node or the sinoatrial node. The SA node is the pacemaker of the heart and is located in the right atrium. Its signals are conducted by specialized cells that can conduct cardiac action potentials very quickly and allow for a fast and synchronized contraction of the heart. Although the cardiac action potentials can be conducted from myocyte to myocyte, this is much slower than being conducted by these specialized cells. So the signals from the SA node causes the atria to contract, then moves down to the AV node or the atrioventricular node. The AV node sort of functions as a hub where all the signals from the atria converge before they are sent down to the ventricles. In a normally functioning heart, it's the only pathway that the cardiac action potentials can take. At the AV node, the signals are paused very briefly to allow time for the ventricles to fill up with blood from the atria, then moves down what's called a bundle of His. The bundle of His splits off to the right and the left bundle branches, then travels down the Purkinje fibers, which ultimately causes the ventricles to contract, again in a fast and synchronized manner. The thing is, the electrical activity of the heart's conduction system is far too small to be picked up on the skin surface by the EKG machine. So what we actually measure is the electrical activity of the cardiac muscle as they contract and relax. Remember learning about action potentials in biology? Remember the sodium and potassium ATPase and how it pumps sodium out and potassium in to create a negative resting membrane potential? Remember learning about the all or none response and how once a certain threshold is reached, the sodium and calcium channels open, causing depolarization that makes everything positive? Then those channels close, potassium channels open, causing repolarization, which makes everything negative again? As the heart pumps, the contractions and relaxation of the cardiac muscles are caused by these action potentials. As the cardiac muscles depolarize and repolarize, it's these changes in electrical activity that we are able to detect with the EKG machine. Again, this is not the same as the electrical activity of the heart's conduction system. I know it's not everyone's favorite subject, but we have to talk a little bit about physics and voltage. So the resting membrane potential of the cardiac muscle is about negative 90 millivolts. Depolarization is when things become positive, and repolarization is when things become negative. We measure voltage using a positive and a negative electrode, and whether depolarization and repolarization will cause an upward or a downward deflection will depend on the direction of its movement. If you have this look on your face right now, don't sweat it. This is as far as we'll really get into it, and we'll go over some examples in later videos. So here's a diagram showing the differently shaped action potentials of different parts of the heart. You can see how they all add up to create what we see as a heartbeat on the EKG. Remember that the activity of the heart's conduction system is far too small to be picked up by the EKG machine, so the electrical activity of the SA node doesn't contribute anything in formation of the heartbeat on the EKG. The activity of the AV node just shows up as a pause, and conduction down the Purkinje fibers also don't contribute anything to the overall EKG. Depolarization of the atria will be seen as what's called a P wave. Depolarization and contraction of the ventricles, which is denoted in red, will show up as what's called the QRS complex. And repolarization and relaxation of the ventricles, which is denoted in blue, will show up as what's called a T wave. Repolarization of the atria totally exists, but its electrical activity is too small and become buried by the much larger QRS complex. It totally makes sense that the QRS complex, which represents ventricular depolarization, is much larger than the P wave, which represents atrial depolarization. Since the atria only has to pump blood into the ventricles, which are right next door, they don't have to squeeze very hard. As a result, they're not very big or muscular and do not generate much electrical activity. So the P wave just appears as a small bump. In contrast, the ventricles have to do a lot more work, especially the left ventricle, which has to pump blood throughout the entire body. So the ventricles are much bigger and muscular and generate a whole lot more electrical activity when they squeeze. This is seen as much larger deflections in the EKG. Here's a little animation of the conduction system and how it correlates with the EKG. Everything starts at the SA node, the atria squeezes, then there's a slight pause at the AV node, which allows time for the ventricles to fill up with blood. Then the ventricles squeeze and repolarizes, getting ready for the next heartbeat. If you're wondering why the T wave, which represents ventricular repolarization, appears as an upward deflection on the EKG, it's because repolarization of the ventricles occur in a backwards direction. Let's talk about how the EKG machine works. Here's an illustration of the first EKG machine, which was invented back in 1895. And here's Willem Einthoven, who ended up winning a Nobel Prize for his invention. The EKG machine we use today looks more like this. Instead of buckets of salt water, it uses multiple electrodes to measure voltage. For a 12-lead EKG, there are 10 electrodes that get placed onto the body. One goes on your right arm, one on your left arm, one on your right leg, and one on your left leg. The electrode on your right leg is used as the ground, and then 6 more electrodes get placed onto the chest surrounding the heart. If you ever played around with a multimeter before, you probably measured voltage at some point. You take the positive electrode and the negative electrode, and you measure the difference in electrical potential or voltage between the two. So we're basically doing the same thing with an EKG, and in a 12-lead EKG, you can think of it like taking voltage measurements at 12 different spots in the body. More accurately, we're measuring the electrical activity of the heart from 12 different angles. This results in what are called 3 limb leads, 3 augmented limb leads, and 6 precordial leads, which add up to make the 12-lead EKG. The limb leads are named 1, 2, and 3 in Roman numerals. The augmented limb leads are named AVR, AVL, and AVF, and the precordial leads are named V1 through V6. If you're wondering what augmented limb leads are exactly, they're leads that are derived from the limb leads 1, 2, and 3, but with its negative pole at the center of the body, which is calculated using these formulas. You totally don't have to understand what any of that means, just know that the augmented limb leads give us more views of the heart's electrical activity. So again, a 12-lead EKG is like looking at the heart from 12 different angles. In lead 1, we're looking at the electrical activity of the heart from the left. In lead 2, we're looking at the heart from the bottom left. And in lead 3, we're looking at the heart from the bottom right. With AVR, we're looking at the heart from the top right, AVL, we're looking at the heart from the top left, and AVF, we're looking at the heart from the bottom. In the precordial leads V1 through V6, we're kind of doing a panorama of the heart, starting from the front of the heart at V1, then wrapping around to the left side of the heart at V6. So this is probably what you're picturing when someone says an EKG. This is a 12-lead EKG, and we can count all of the leads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Again, the 12 leads are made up of the 3 limb leads, 1, 2, and 3, 3 augmented limb leads, AVR, AVL, and AVF, and the 6 precordial leads, V1 through V6. On the grid paper that the EKG is printed on, x-axis represents time and y-axis represents voltage. So the EKG is a 10-second recording of the heart's electrical activity, and taller and deeper the peaks are, larger the depolarization and repolarization that was picked up on the EKG. It's commonplace to see lead 2 across the length of the EKG at the bottom. This means we were looking at the heart from the view of lead 2 for a longer period of time than all of the other leads. Since the left ventricle does the most work and is the most muscular, it also generates the most electrical activity. Remember that the heartbeat starts at the SA node, which is located in the right atrium. This means that the overall axis of depolarization is pointed from the right atrium to the left ventricle. So lead 2 gives us the best view of the heart in terms of its overall electrical activity. Certain leads can be grouped together based on the angle that they're looking at the heart. Lead 2, 3, and AVF are referred to as the inferior leads because they look at the heart from the inferior aspect of the heart. Lead V1 and V2 are called the septoleads as they look at the heart's septum, which separates the heart into the right and the left. V3 and V4 are called anterior leads, and V1 through V4 are typically grouped together as the anteroseptal leads. V5, V6, lead 1, and AVL are called the lateral leads because they're looking at the heart from the lateral aspect of the heart from the left side. And AVR is kind of left alone doing its own thing because the AVR just looks at the right atrium where there isn't a whole lot happening. By grouping certain leads together, it can help clinicians determine what's going on with the patient. For example, if you see an abnormality in lead 2, 3, and AVF, which are all looking at the heart from the inferior aspect, you may suspect there's something funky going on in that area of the heart. If you see something odd in lead 1, AVL, V5, and V6, you might suspect a problem with the lateral portion of the heart. Because different coronary arteries supply blood to different areas of the heart, We can also correlate certain EKG leads to certain coronary arteries. For example, if you see ST elevations in the anteroseptal leads, which were leads V1 through V4, you may suspect that this patient is having a STEMI due to a complete occlusion in the LAD or the left anterior descending artery. Or let's say you're seeing T-wave inversions in lead 2, 3, and AVF. Now you may be suspecting an N-STEMI caused by a partial occlusion in the RCA or the left circumflex. So that's part 1 of the intro to the EKG. In part 2, we will begin to go over how to interpret the EKG.